Let's take a look at a summary of the new HTML5 forms, attributes, and methods that HTML5 adds for form support so we can get a better idea of what we'll be doing throughout the course. First, let's take a look at the new attributes for forms and form elements. This table illustrates the new form element attributes that you can use on certain form elements, and some of these are really useful and replace scripting techniques you used to have to use in older browsers. The first one, the autofocus, specifies a form element that should receive the input focus when the page loads. So when the page comes up, the browser will look for the first element that has autofocus on it and give it the focus. The autocomplete attribute indicates that this element's value might be remembered for future entries. Some browsers provide the ability to remember stuff that you've typed into certain text fields and other input elements, and this controls whether or not you want the browser to remember those values. The pattern attribute is pretty powerful. It restricts the input of a field to match a regular expression pattern. So for example, if you only want an input field to have 5 digits because, say, it's a zip code, you can specify a pattern that it has to match. The placeholder attribute specifies text that appears in the element until the user gives it the focus and enters an actual value. And you've probably seen this before in forms, in edit fields that provide some little hint to the user, and when you click in the field, the value goes away and you type in some text. The noValidate and form noValidate attributes are used on forms. These indicate to the browser that the browser should not apply any validation logic to the form when it gets submitted. And we'll see why you want to do that later. And then finally, there's the required attribute, which indicates that the field is required to have a valid value before the form can be submitted. Next, there's new text selection APIs. Now, the select method you're probably used to seeing, that's an existing method from old school forms that selects all the text in a given input control. But there's a few new properties. There's the selection start and selection end property that lets you get a sub-selection or the selection start point if they're both the same value in an input field. And there's a new function called set selection range, which takes 2 arguments, a start and an end, that lets you set a sub-selection into the input control. So it's no longer an all or nothing proposition. In the old days, when you called select, it selected all the text, and now you get finer grained control over the selection. There's also CSS styling for form elements that are valid, invalid, or required. And if you saw earlier when I was showing the demonstration form, some fields were red and some fields were green. That's because they were using these styles. So now you can apply pseudo classes to elements so that the browser will style them when they're in a state, such as valid or invalid, or when something is required. All right, let's take a summary of the new form input types because there's quite a few of those. In fact, there's more than a dozen. These are new input types. So when you put a control in a form, you used to have to say something like input, type equals text. And in fact, text was one of the only ones you had as far as input fields were concerned. You can do a whole bunch of new ones now. So there's input types for search, which indicates the field is used for searching. There's tel for telephone numbers, URL for web addresses, emails, self-explanatory. There's input types for entering numbers and selecting a number from a range. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 new input types that have to do with selecting dates and times. And in fact, there's even a new input type for selecting colors. So now that we've seen a summary of all the new features that are available in HTML5 web forms, we can take a look at the rest of them in greater detail throughout the rest of the course.